Welcome to the mini book podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we are analyzing critical excerpts from the powerful new book, The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and by Andrew W. Carl. We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this analysis, we would encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author. And just a quick note, the voices of this analysis sound European, but the content creator is African American and plans on using African American voices in the future.
Our mission today is to really get into this source material. We're setting the stage for an exploration of how local tax administration, which, sounds like the most boring bureaucratic part of government, actually became one of the most powerful and enduring instruments of racial exploitation and wealth extraction in American history. What the book lays out is this fiscal machine that has worked consistently for a century and a half, linking the Jim Crow South all the way to the modern segregated North.
Yeah, let's start unpacking that. I think one of the most powerful things the book does is show that this isn't just history. The author doesn't start in, say, 1870. He starts right now, or close to it, in places you wouldn't expect, like Long Island, New York. And right away, he hits you with this incredible paradox. These discriminatory tax practices lead to incredibly high taxes, but at the same time, shockingly low services.
And that paradox is really the engine of what the book calls the black tax. It's so critical to understand that this wasn't some relic of the past. It was operating, openly in the post-Jim Crow North. The stories the author shares, they're heartbreaking. These are just ordinary people trying to achieve the American dream of owning a home.
Yeah.
And the moment they do, they run headfirst into this invisible structural injustice.
Yeah, take the story of Mrs. Wright. She lived in a modest house in a neighborhood on Long Island that was predominantly black. And year after year, she sees this thing that just feels profoundly unfair. Her annual tax bill is about the same amount as the bill for a house that's maybe worth $200,000 in a wealthy white neighborhood just a few miles away in the very same county.
And that disparity, that's what the book defines as inequitable assessment. It's a crucial term. In those wealthier white areas, assessors would often keep the property valuations artificially low compared to their actual market price. Why? Well, it was to minimize the tax burden on residents who, frankly, had the political power to complain and demand that kind of treatment.
So they get a break.
They get a break. Meanwhile, in black neighborhoods, the opposite happens. The property values are often assessed closer to, or sometimes even above, their real market value. And when you combine that with the high tax rate that a struggling town needs to survive, the final bill is it's a crushing financial load.
And the impact on Mrs. Wright's family, her finances, it was immediate. It was devastating for her future. We're talking about home ownership, which is supposed to be the main way people build wealth in America, right? For generations. But for her, it was eating up more than half of her entire income.
Exactly. So instead of her home being an asset that's building equity for her family, it becomes this liability. It's a constant drain on her resources. The book says she had to take a second job just to keep up with the payments.
Wow.
And she described her life as just perpetually robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
This didn't just make life harder. It systematically destroyed any chance of saving money, of investing, of moving up. The sources are clear on this. Unlike white families who could use their home equity, black homeowners were trapped by a system that demanded these huge contributions, but gave them absolutely no way to accumulate wealth.
And the book gives us another, just a really powerful example with a woman named Elizabeth Milton.
Right, Elizabeth Milton, a working mother trying to build a home for her family in Wyandanch, which...
That's on Long Island, right? In the so-called Black Belt.
Exactly. She buys this modest house, for about $35,000 back in 1984. But what happens next with the taxes is just, it's staggering. Her tax burden was, from a math perspective, just unbelievable. Her annual tax bill was 6% of her property's total value.
6%? What does that compare to?
Well, the author points out that this was 6 times more than what white homeowners in the next town over, a wealthier town, were paying relative to their home's value. Think about that for a second. A 1% tax on a $300,000 home is manageable. A 6% tax on a $35,000 home is a catastrophe. It means that in just about 16 years, she would have paid the entire original purchase price of her home all over again. Just in property taxes.
Just in taxes. That's before even touching the mortgage principal.
Before the mortgage principal, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an impossible situation.
And the sources really capture the human cost of this. It's not just numbers. Milton talked about times when the stress of paying these taxes meant Well, it meant real deprivation for her kids, sending them to bed hungry, not being able to afford new sneakers for her daughters for years.
Hmm.
She's just struggling to survive. And all the while, she's paying this effective tax rate that's basically subsidizing the prosperity of her wealthier neighbors.
And that right there is the core injustice of the black tax. People like Wright and Milton, they paid the highest effective taxes, but they got the absolute least in return. And the ultimate slap in the face was where that money didn't go. Her kids, their kids, they attended two of the most chronically underfunded and lowest performing school districts in the entire state.
So the high taxes weren't even funding good services.
Not at all. They were just barely keeping these structurally impoverished towns from going bankrupt. And on top of all that, the source notes that her investment was doomed from the start. Home values just flatlined the second a neighborhood became black. And these crazy high tax bills, they pushed those values down even further. It was, as the book says, a perfect system for extracting wealth, all disguised as, just boring local governance.
So you have this slow, grinding pressure from these unfair assessments, but the book also shows how even a tiny mistake could lead to an immediate total loss. This is where we get into the weaponization of tax delinquency, and the story of Annie Kennedy it's just a nightmare.
Annie Kennedy was a housekeeper. She spent decades of her life working in the homes of white families. And her dream was simple, just to own her own home. In 1973, she does it. She gets a mortgage on a small house in Hempstead, using her entire life savings, $2,000, as the down payment. She works tirelessly, well into her 70s, and she achieves her goal. She pays off the mortgage. She owns her home free and clear. She has security.
But then, 13 years later, in 1986, everything falls apart. She decides it's time to sell the home, and she discovers that the house isn't legally hers anymore. All that work, all that equity, her life savings, just gone. And why? Because years earlier, she had failed to pay a single $92.07 school tax bill.
It's shocking. And to understand how this could happen, we have to break down the mechanics of tax delinquency and the role of the tax lien investor.
Yeah.
So a homeowner becomes tax delinquent if they miss a property tax payment. That's it. Once that happens, the local government can sell that debt, the tax lien, to a private investor.
And that's the tax lien investor.
That's the tax lien investor. This person or company pays the town the $92, and in exchange, they now have the right to collect that debt from the homeowner, plus a lot of interest and fees.
Now, in Kennedy's case, she always said she never even got the notice for that $92 bill, which seems totally plausible. Mail gets lost, things happen.
And that's where the system was basically engineered to fail people like her. The law only required the county to send the notices. It didn't require them to prove the homeowner actually received them.
That's a huge loophole.
A massive systemic loophole. So an investor bought that land based on that tiny unreceived bill. And because Annie Kennedy never redeemed the land, meaning paid the debt plus all the penalties, within a certain time frame, the investor was legally allowed to take the property. They seized her entire home and all the equity she had built over decades for a $92 debt.
I mean, how could that be legally justified? A debt of less than $100 wipes out a person's entire life savings. How did they defend that?
The argument from the towns was that they needed this system to ensure cash flow, to fund schools, police, the basics. Selling the liens guaranteed they got their money right away. The investors, for their part, argued that the high interest rates and the threat of seizing the property were necessary to get them to participate in the market.
So it was an incentive.
An incentive.
Yeah.
The whole system was built to give the investor total protection and the homeowner, especially on the notification side, almost none. It just shows the devastating consequence for black wealth.
The whole idea of building something up over decades could be erased in an instant because of a piece of lost mail.
And the source material uses the word exploitation over and over again. This wasn't just an accident or some government inefficiency.
No, not at all.
As the book details later, it was a carefully designed predatory framework. That is the key takeaway from this part. It was an actively profitable business model that was powered by systemic vulnerability. Tax delinquency was higher in black neighborhoods, not because people were irresponsible, but because of the economic pressure created by housing discrimination and those very same inequitable tax bills we just talked about. When you combine those high draining tax burdens in these devalued neighborhoods with this invisible, unforgiving system for taking property, the consequences for black wealth accumulation are, well, they're profound, they're continuous, And they are highly predictable.
Okay, so to really understand how deep this goes, we have to look back at its historical roots. We have to go back to the post-emancipation South, because that's where you see that this wasn't just about economics. Discriminatory taxation was a political weapon designed to control and punish Black citizens.
Yes, you absolutely have to start there. In the 50 years after emancipation, something truly heroic happened. Despite all the violence, all the legal barriers, African Americans managed to accumulate nearly 16 million acres of land.
16 million acres.
16 million acres. This was the foundation of an independent Black economy, and very importantly, a foundation for independent political power.
And that accumulation of land was seen as a major threat by the white political and economic establishment.
A profound threat.
Yeah.
As soon as Reconstruction governments collapsed and the so-called Redeemer governments took over, local white tax administrators launched a counterattack. Their goal, and the book is very explicit about this, was to make Black-owned land more expensive to hold and easier to lose. And their primary weapon was the local tax assessment roll.
And this whole campaign was so effective mainly because of Black disenfranchisement. Can you break down how not being able to vote connected directly to the tax system?
Sure. Black disenfranchisement is the term for all the methods, legal and illegal, that were used to stop African Americans from voting during Jim Crow. We're talking about poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and just outright violence and intimidation. And if you can't vote, you have zero political power, no recourse, no representation. This gave the local white tax officials, the assessors, the sheriffs, what the book calls free rein. They didn't have to serve Black residents as constituents. They could treat them as subjects to exploit. So assessors all across the South systematically overvalued Black-owned property, even the smallest little plots of land, to make sure the owners were under constant financial strain.
So where Reconstruction had maybe offered a tiny bit of hope, with some policies that tried to use high taxes to break up the old plantations, the post-Reconstruction system just flipped that completely on its head. It used taxes to enforce white supremacy and steal back that land.
That's the strategic shift exactly. The tax system in the Jim Crow South became the foundation of what the author calls a fiscal apartheid. Even when Black citizens paid their taxes, which they did, they were systematically cut off from the benefits of public spending.
And the lack of those services created these really clear physical dividing lines in towns.
Oh, absolutely. The neglect was intentional, and you could see it everywhere.
Yeah.
The sources have this incredibly stark imagery. One northern visitor to a southern town said you didn't need any signs to know where the white and Black neighborhoods were. The Black area began exactly where the paved roads turned to dirt. The storm pipes become open ditches.
Wow.
Sidewalks just vanish. Garbage isn't collected for weeks. Access to clean water, to modern sewers, it was a constant public health crisis. Booker T. Washington wrote about this, saying Black people were forced to receive inferior accommodations in return for the taxes they pay. This wasn't just poor city planning. It was the physical result of fiscal discrimination, deliberately devaluing Black homes and Black lives.
And this plunder was at its most outrageous when you look at public education.
It was institutionalized theft. There's no other way to describe it. Black tax dollars, paid by property owners, were actively diverted to fund white schools. The source highlights this jaw-dropping example from Brunswick County, Virginia, which was majority Black. Even though Black property owners paid for over a quarter of the county's school funds, white officials gave only $3 per Black child for education each year.
$3.
$3, compared to $45 for every white school child.
So a 15-to-1 inequality multiplier. Black property owners were literally forced to pay for the education of white children while their own kids got almost nothing.
And because the official system was so broken, Black communities had to resort to what the sources call Black self-taxation. They had to tax themselves a second time. They were constantly fundraising, holding church raffles, community drives, anything they could do just to provide the most basic supplies and safe buildings for their kids' schools. The book makes a really important point here. African Americans at the time understood their oppression in fiscal terms. When they protested, they used the language of taxpayer citizenship. They were demanding the civic benefits they had already paid for.
So you have the slow weapons of high assessments and no services, but then you have the heavy artillery, direct white retaliation, often using the tax system to destroy any center of Black independence. And the story of Edmondson, Arkansas it's a powerful and ultimately tragic example of this.
Edmondson was a profound symbol of Black self-determination. It was founded in 1901 by these visionary Black Republican leaders who made a vow that none of the land in their town would ever be sold to whites. And it grew. It became this thriving, independent town. It had its own bank, 10 stores, a post office, a big school for over 500 kids. It had the first NAACP branch in the whole region. It was a functioning, prosperous black town in the heart of Jim Crow.
And that success, its very existence, made it a target.
Absolutely. The surrounding white planter class was determined to crush this hub of independence. They started by cutting off services, closing the colored school, and redirecting the funds. Then they moved to economic infiltration, using something called a straw purchase scheme.
A straw purchase? What's that?
It's where they used a black man as a front man to buy a lot, pretending he was going to open a black-owned business. But as soon as the deed was signed, he immediately sold it to a white planter. This planter then opened a store that catered only to white sharecroppers, basically planting a flag of white control right in the middle of Edmonton's commercial district. And after that came violence, arson, intimidation.
But the final blow, the one that really crippled the town, came right back to the corrupt tax system.
That's when the power structure really brought the hammer down. Local officials started carrying out fraudulent tax sales. This wasn't about collecting taxes. It was about confiscation. The county sheriff, often working with white speculators, would just not even try to collect the tax. They wouldn't file the legal notices correctly. Then they'd declare the property delinquent and sell it for pennies on the dollar to their friends. In 1936, organizers documented that county officials had violated pretty much every single law that was supposed to protect property owners during this process.
And when the NAACP got involved, with Thurgood Marshall himself, why couldn't the legal system fix this?
It failed because of systemic bias and judicial precedent. Marshall and the NAACP, they condemned the injustice, but the case just collapsed. The federal courts had basically decided to slam the federal courthouse doors shut on matters of local taxation. End of quote. The precedent was that these kinds of disputes had to be handled in state courts. And if you're a black victim of land theft in the Jim Crow South, taking your case against powerful white planters to a local state court,
You have no chance.
you have zero chance. The suit was dismissed in 1948. The land was lost forever, and the descendants of the founders of Edmonton were left in poverty. The fiscal system had successfully dismantled a black American dream.
It's so clear how that system worked in the South, but it's just as crucial to see how that same logic was adapted and applied in the North. During the Great Migration, millions of African Americans moved north looking for jobs, for dignity, for rights, and they find that northern cities have their own kind of racial tax lines.
The promise was enormous. People read newspapers like the Chicago Defender and saw ads for wide paved streets, modern schools, beautiful public parks, all the things funded by a big city tax base. But the reality was completely different. Housing discrimination forced them into segregated neighborhoods that, even though they were inside city limits, got the short end of both sticks. High taxes, but lagging services. It was the same pattern as the Jim Crow South, just in a different setting.
And that inequality was so baked in, it even poisoned their access to public spaces. The tragedy that sparked the 1919 Chicago race riot is a perfect signal of this.
That event says so much. Eugene Williams, a black teenager, is swimming in Lake Michigan. He's on a raft and he drifts across an invisible color line in the water. A white bather throws a rock, hits him, and he drowns. That was the spark for the riot, and it symbolized this deep injustice. Black citizens were paying taxes that funded the entire lakefront, the parks, the public water, but they couldn't even use them safely. And the neglect just continued. In the 1930s in New York City, only 1 out of 255 new playgrounds built with public money was located in Harlem.
One.
In Chicago, white schools had empty seats, while black schools were so overcrowded they had to run triple shifts. They were paying full price for half the service.
And this environment, high taxes, low services, constant financial instability, it created the perfect conditions for a new, more sophisticated kind of predator, the tax buyer.
Yes, this is a major turning point in the book's analysis. Northern cities, often struggling for cash, started selling off their unpaid tax debts to private investors. So we need to be really clear about how this worked. A homeowner is delinquent. The city sells the tax land. The investor, or tax buyer, buys that link land. They are essentially now the collector. They pay the city the debt, and in return, they get the right to collect that money, plus incredibly high legally mandated interest from the homeowner. And if the homeowner can't pay it all back by a certain deadline, the tax buyer can legally take the entire property.
The story of Louis and Doretta Balthazar in Chicago just shows how devastating this could be over such a small mistake.
The Balthazars were a working-class couple. They had moved north, and they invested everything they had, over $16,000, into a 3-flat building on the west side. Louis Balthazar missed a single property tax payment while he was in the VA hospital. Just one. And that was all it took for Chicago's top tax buyer, a man named Alan Blair, to pounce. He acquired the lien.
And the book shows how Blair didn't just follow the process. He used coercion and really legal extortion to take their home.
He was swift and brutal. He lied to them, telling them that just by buying the lien, he already owned the property, which wasn't true. He then offered them a deal. They could become his tenants in their own home, but they had to sign papers right then and there, giving up all rights to the title. And he threatened them. He said, if you don't sign, you'll be evicted immediately, and all your belongings will be tossed to the curb by the weekend.
That's terrifying.
Terrifying. They were confused. They didn't understand the law. They were scared of losing everything they owned, so they signed. And just like that, they lost their home, their entire life savings, over one missed payment. The law in Illinois was so harsh that this was all perfectly legal.
So the state basically licensed private investors to commit what sounds like legal extortion. And the book argues this wasn't random. This was a very deliberate, very profitable business model.
Incredibly calculated. Tax buyers like Alan Blair specifically targeted black neighborhoods for a few key economic reasons. First, because of segregation, there was always high demand for housing there. So if he seized a property, he knew he could easily flip it or rent it out. Second, he knew the homeowners were vulnerable because of all the fiscal pressures we've been talking about. And third, and this was crucial for his profits, the interest rates set by law were sky high. In Illinois, the debt could double every 6 months. It guaranteed a massive return on his investment.
So Blair might buy a tax certificate for a few $100s. What would he then demand from the original owners if they wanted their home back?
He would offer to sell them their own home back, but for up to 80% of its market value. It was pure wealth extraction.
Wow.
And if they couldn't afford to buy it back at his inflated price, he'd often force them to rent their own homes from him. They'd become tenants in the very properties they had already paid for, and the cycle of wealth extraction would just continue through their rent checks.
This whole scheme eventually came to light because of some really aggressive investigative journalism, right? Particularly Mike Royko in Chicago.
Yes, Royko's work was critical. He exposed Blair's whole predatory operation, telling the stories of dozens of victims, like an 83-year-old widow named Veronica Mycetic, who was evicted over back taxes. His articles brought this shady world of tax buying out into the open, and it caused a huge public outcry. For over a month, the Chicago papers were filled with stories about the devastation this was causing.
But even with all that public outrage, with all this clear evidence of the harm it was causing, the tax buyers were somehow able to avoid any real comprehensive reform.
They were. And their defense was very shrewd. They argued that they were performing a vital public service. They said they were making sure that local governments got the money they needed to operate, that they were ensuring municipal solvency.
So they were the good guys.
They framed themselves as the good guys. They claimed that without them, and without the high interest rates and threat of seizure, tax delinquency would get out of control and cripple city budgets. And that rhetoric, that their predation was a necessary evil for fiscal health, it worked. It shielded them from major reform and allowed the system to keep destroying black wealth, all under the cover of fiscal responsibility.
The system is just so adaptive. It didn't stop with Jim Crow. It didn't stop after the tax buyer exposés. It just got more entrenched in the second half of the 20th century, adapting to things like suburbanization and the big political shifts of the neoliberal era.
That adaptation really started after World War II. Federal programs like FHA and VA mortgage insurance, they systematically favored white borrowers. This fueled white flight to the suburbs. But the key part is that as these new suburbs were created, they engaged in what the book calls fiscal fragmentation.
Okay, let's pause on that term, fiscal fragmentation. Can you walk us through what that actually means and how it locked in inequality?
It sounds technical, but the idea is pretty simple and deeply unfair. Fiscal fragmentation is when a big metro area gets carved up into lots and lots of small, independent local governments. These new suburbs weren't just neighborhoods. They were their own little tax kingdoms. And they strategically drew their borders to cut themselves off from existing black communities.
So they could hoard the tax base.
Exactly. The whole goal was to compete for wealthy residents and valuable businesses to build up their own tax base while making sure they had zero responsibility for funding services for the poor or for minorities nearby.
And the result of that competition was these massive differences in local resources, especially for schools, since schools rely so heavily on local property taxes.
The disparity became structural. It became permanent. The book uses the example of Chicago's suburbs. Some of the wealthy school districts there, with their huge corporate and residential tax bases, had a per-pupil tax base of over $500,000.
Wow. And the poorest districts.
The poorest districts, often the ones designated for black families, were struggling with a tax base as low as $6,000 per pupil.
That's not a gap, that's a canyon. So it means the people in the poor districts were actually paying more for less education, right?
Precisely. They might have a really high tax rate, maybe even higher than the wealthy suburb next door. But because their total tax base, the total value of all their property, was so small, the amount of money they could actually raise was tiny. And that lack of funding meant decaying schools, old textbooks, high teacher turnover. It penalized black students for generations. The whole system was built to reward segregation and punish diversity.
And this all comes to a head right at the moment when black leaders are finally starting to win political power in those older cities. You think of someone like Richard Hatcher, elected mayor of Gary, Indiana in 1967. They win the election, but they inherit a fiscal nightmare.
They inherit cities that are already fiscally crippled. They've been starved by white flight on one side and by corporate tax dodging on the other. These new black mayors found themselves in an impossible position. They had the political power, but they had no money to actually govern or provide the services their voters desperately needed.
The book points to U.S. Steel in Gary, Indiana, as a perfect example of a corporation exploiting this.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, U.S. Steel had a corrupt deal with a local political machine that gave them what the sources call scandalously low tax assessments. This deal cost the city of Gary somewhere between $16 and $30 million every single year in lost revenue. And the consequence was brutal. In 1970, Gary's budget was so tight they had to lay off over 200 teachers.
Unbelievable.
The mayor had the mandate from the people, but U.S. Steel had all the fiscal power.
And it wasn't just corporations. This manipulation of property assessments was happening systematically in big cities, like Chicago.
Yes. In Chicago, it was blatant. The assessor's office would slash the assessments for big political donors and for powerful voting blocs. It was basically a tax gruck for the rich and connected. At the same time, low-income black neighborhoods like North Lawndale were getting severely overassessed, sometimes by as much as 40%. So the poorest homeowners were paying taxes on a value that was far higher than what their property was actually worth.
And this whole scam was hidden by this technical thing called fractional assessment. What is that, and how did it keep the average person from figuring out what was going on?
Fractional assessment is a deliberately confusing practice. It means you assess a property not at its full market value, but at some fraction of it, say 33%. The problem was, this fraction was inconsistent and applied arbitrarily. And crucially, your tax bill would only show the final assessed value. It wouldn't show the fraction they used or how it compared to the real market price.
So you had no way of knowing if you were being treated fairly.
Zero transparent way of knowing. A homeowner in North Lawndale would have no idea that their property was being assessed at 40% of its value, while a politically connected developer downtown was secretly getting a rate of 20%. This lack of transparency allowed billions to be siphoned away from schools and public services, and it all looked perfectly legal on paper.
So on one side, you have black communities starting these movements for tax justice in the 1970s, demanding fair funding and wealth redistribution. But the political system responds with a totally different demand: tax cuts.
This is a huge political and philosophical shift. The passage of Proposition 13 in California in 1978. That was the moment the tax cut movement really triumphed over the tax justice movement. Prop 13 severely limited property taxes and locked in low assessments for existing homeowners. This overwhelmingly benefited wealthier, often white homeowners who have been in their homes for a long time. The sources point out that black voters were the only major demographic group to oppose the measure.
And why did the black community oppose it when it was sold as this great benefit for all taxpayers?
They opposed it because they saw what was coming. They knew that these massive tax cuts would lead to immediate, devastating cuts to the public services that renters, the poor, and minorities relied on most.
Schools, parks, libraries.
Exactly. Public education, libraries, social welfare programs. It became a zero-sum game. The tax breaks for the wealthy came directly at the expense of social services for the disadvantaged. The system was now designed not just to extract wealth, but to actively tear down the public safety nets.
And as federal aid to cities dried up in the following years, these fiscally starved cities had to get aggressive. They turned to what the author calls punitive entrepreneurialism.
This is the grim, late-stage evolution of the black tax. It's where the state turns its police force into a collection agency. Cities and towns, desperate for revenue, started relying on fines, fees, and court costs. The most famous example, of course, is Ferguson, Missouri. The police there were actively enforcing the most minor subjective violations, having saggy pants, mismatched curtains in your window, wheeze in your yard. And the fines from these tickets made up an astonishing 20% of the city's entire budget.
So the police were literally acting as tax collectors, and their targets were the poorest and most vulnerable citizens.
Exactly. The system was designed to extract wealth through policing and punishment instead of property taxes. It weaponized minor legal offenses to fund the city, trapping low-income residents in this cycle of debt, warrants, and court fees they could never escape.
And this wasn't just Ferguson. Big cities like Chicago did it too, using traffic cameras and shortening yellow light times to generate hundreds of millions in fines, which disproportionately hit Black and Latino neighborhoods. The reliance on extracting revenue from the poor had become a mainstream municipal strategy.
Now, the book is very clear that this long history of extraction did not go unchallenged. There's been a constant history of resistance, especially at the grassroots level in the South.
One of the most courageous examples comes from Edwards, Mississippi in 1966. There had been major protests and a boycott against segregation in the town. In retaliation, the tax collector, a woman named Ruth Harrell, went through the assessment rolls and deliberately, surgically raised the assessments on anyone who had been involved in the movement.
And the numbers show how targeted it was. Black property values went up 51% on average, while white-owned property in the same town went up by just 5.4%.
It wasn't an economic reappraisal, it was political punishment, pure and simple. This was a standard tactic. Activists knew it. When one activist's assessment more than doubled, he agreed to be the lead plaintiff in a federal lawsuit to fight back.
And besides fighting retaliation, there were legal battles for service equity, demanding the sidewalks and sewers they'd already paid for. The case Hawkins v. Town of Shaw was a huge turning point.
Hawkins v. Town of Shaw in 1971 was revolutionary. Black residents of Shaw, Mississippi, sued the town for violating their 14th Amendment right to equal protection. They brought in maps and photos, irrefutable proof that the black side of town had no paved roads, no storm drains, no sewers, while the white side had all of those things, and they won. The victory was hailed as historic. Some compared it to Brown v. Board of Education because it set a new legal precedent that you could sue a city for racially discriminatory delivery of basic services.
So while the lawyers were in court, other organizations were on the ground trying to physically save the land being lost to tax sales.
Yes, this led to groups like the Emergency Land Fund, or ELF. Their strategy was brilliant. ELF's staffers would go to the tax auctions and just start bidding on Black-owned properties to save them from white speculators. This was incredibly disruptive to the old system. The sources say that in a single day, ELF recovered nearly 1,500 acres of Black-owned land, worth over $1 million for just a tiny fraction of its value. It showed just how vulnerable this land was.
And this whole fight was made even harder by the complicated issue of heirs' property. Can you define that term and explain why it made land so vulnerable?
Heirs' property is one of the most tragic parts of this story. It's land that's been passed down through generations informally, without a formal will or a clear legal title, so the ownership is fragmented. You might have dozens of cousins who all have a claim to the land. This makes it really hard to get a loan or use the land as collateral. But for tax purposes, it was a huge vulnerability. The tax records were often in a deceased ancestor's name, so the people actually living on the land would never see the tax bill.
So the communal way the land was passed down, which is meant to protect it, ended up making it a target for speculators.
Exactly. The legal mess made it a perfect target, especially in places that were starting to see development, like the Sea Islands. The book talks about Dofusky Island in South Carolina, where Black-owned land valuations suddenly shot up by as much as 700%. Why? Because developers wanted it for resorts. These new astronomical tax bills priced the families right off their ancestral land, forcing them to sell and transferring that prime real estate directly to developers.
And as we've noted, this predatory system is still very much alive today. It's just updated its methods.
It's incredibly active. In a city like Baltimore today, tax sales are increasingly used against Black and elderly homeowners on fixed incomes, not just for property taxes, but for unpaid water bills. The story of Vicki Valentine is a modern version of Annie Kennedy's nightmare. She was evicted from the home her family had owned for 30 years over a small, unpaid water bill.
And the mechanism is the same. A third party buys the debt and then piles on fees and penalties that make it impossible to pay.
Precisely. A $272 water bill can balloon to over $6,000 in fees, and then they take your home. Even black-led city councils feel trapped. They argue they desperately need the revenue from these sales. It shows how dependent the modern city has become on this system of extraction, continuing the very cycle of inequality they might want to break.
So, given this deep, systemic 150-year history of exploitation, the book makes a very compelling case that small, piecemeal reforms just aren't going to cut it.
Right. Incremental reforms, like special homestead exemptions or programs for the elderly, they consistently fall short. They're often complicated to apply for, they're poorly advertised, and local tax officials have very little incentive to help people sign up and reduce their own tax base. Study after study shows that the low-income people who need these programs the most are the least likely to be enrolled in them. The system is designed to be hard to navigate.
Which leads the author to a much more radical proposal for real structural change. What does that solution look like?
It involves two huge fundamental shifts that would completely redefine the relationship between wealth, taxes, and public services. First, a universal home tax exemption. This would be tied to the median home value in an area, and it would completely exempt all low and middle income homes from local property taxes. And second, to make up for that revenue, you'd have a federal wealth tax on the top 1% of the wealthiest individuals. That money would then be used to fund local governments all across the country.
So the goal is to completely redefine what the property tax even is, to move it away from being this punitive weapon.
Exactly. This shift would transform the property tax from what it has been for 150 years, a regressive tax on housing that punishes the poor and undermines wealth, into what it should be. A progressive tax on concentrated wealth that funds high-quality, universal public goods for everyone. By freeing lower-income homeowners from property taxes, you make them immune to tax buyers and speculators overnight. You break the cycle of the black tax and create a foundation for genuine fiscal equity. Our analysis of this history of taxation, seen through the experience of Black Americans, it just reveals a really profound and uncomfortable truth. Our local tax systems have historically been, and they continue to be, a powerful engine of inequality. This wasn't an accident. It was a complex system engineered to make sure that those with the least power were left with the heaviest burdens, the fewest benefits, and the greatest vulnerabilities, constantly undermining every attempt to build and keep wealth for over a century and a half.
We've seen in the source material that we absolutely have the wealth in this country to pay for clean water, excellent schools, and equal services for every single community. The wealth is there. But we have chosen a fiscal structure that ensures it remains intensely concentrated and intensely protected. And it often uses the mundane bureaucracy of local taxation as its primary shield. The question is, what choices will we make now to finally dismantle this history of extraction? Thank you for listening to this mini-book podcast, African American Books Edition. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and tell others about this podcast. We also invite you to suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear in future episodes. Thank you again for subscribing and listening.